Hi, I'm delighted to invite you all to our multi-part panel on the future of U.S. climate action here today. Thank you all for coming. We're going to have two exceptional panels separated by a brief pre-recorded video. I will moderate your first panel. My name is Ben Longstreth. I am the director of the Carbon Capture Program at the Clean Air Task Force. And today's first panel is going to focus on industrial decarbonization in the United States and what we can look forward to with the recent passage of two key bills, the bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. And I will introduce my distinguished panelists, and we'll get started. First, I'd like to introduce Senator Whitehouse. Senator Whitehouse needs little introduction to anyone who has been following U.S. climate action. He is a relentless champion of action in Congress on climate, large, small, any improvements we can make. He is particularly notable for being continuously seeking areas where we can find bipartisan solutions, and we salute him for that. Next, we have Jeremy Harrell, who is the Chief of Strategy for ClearPath. ClearPath is a conservative research and advocacy organization based in the United States that focuses on moving forward all the solutions we need to protect our climate. I think it's fair to say that ClearPath particularly focuses on bringing Republicans along and finding solutions that they can support. Again, we appreciate that. Third, we have Dr. Jennifer Holmgren, who is the CEO of LanzaTech. Dr. Holmgren has received numerous awards, including the Edison Achievement Award for her contributions to innovation, which is key on this topic, and is the CEO of LanzaTech, an organization that is seeking to use industrial waste to create fuels and lower emissions. So let's dive into it. I'd just be interested initially for the three of you to comment on how the outlook for industrial decarbonization has changed with passage of the two acts I mentioned before, Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. Senator Whitehouse, would you like to start?
Well, when you spend $350 billion plus to support decarbonization, you're going to have a pretty significant effect. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but a lot of it was to support industry, small business, big industry, and where the recipient is an apartment building or a home, then that has a very strong indirect effect on industry because they go to buy the equipment that increases efficiency from the market. So that's going to, I think, be a very significant tipping point. Being through that legislative process also politically frees up the Biden administration to do a lot more of the things that they can do purely with executive powers alone. You saw a piece of that yesterday. The most important thing that I've seen happen during this conference was buried in the methane rule that was released with the president's speech, and that is that it bakes in a $120 per ton social cost of carbon. So like an in-house carbon price that many corporations use, this will start with EPA, but I think ultimately it's likely to be expanded out to cover government purchasing, permitting, leasing, regulation across all the agencies, and have a really, really profound effect. I think we're going to amp up methane enforcement, take advantage of new methane rules, and that is going to be significant. I hope that we'll move more aggressively towards aligning with the EU's CBAM, carbon border adjustment. Again, that's something that the president through his tariff authorities can do a lot to move on. So we have these areas in which we have multiple tools and, in those cases, open avenues to solve the economic dilemma of an industry that relies on polluting for free, what an economist would call negative externalities, to do its business. And stepping in to fix that has been a very big deal, and I know when we hear from our clean AV fuel expert, without some way of offsetting that negative externality of fossil fuel, you'd have had no chance, right? But we have a company, and we have innovation, and we have prospects, and we have a future because we offset that. Now, the more we can make that permanent, 45Q is a temporary measure that provides a tax benefit. IRA's longer lasting and provides bigger tax benefits and returns. But ultimately, a proper price on carbon to balance the market and have it work properly is going to be the long-term goal.
Thank you. Jeremy, you want to take the question?
Absolutely. I think there's a huge opportunity here, and I really feel like we've seen a shift in the debate in Congress in the United States about climate policy over the last 5 years. And why I'm really confident that we're going to be able to build on these big successes is really dating back to 4 years ago. We've had 4 big pieces of legislation in the technological innovation and climate space. The Energy Act of 2020, the Infrastructure Bill, the CHIPS Bill, and then ultimately the Inflation Reduction Act that have gotten enacted over the last 4 years. 3 of the 4 of those on a bipartisan basis. And frankly, on the Inflation Reduction Act, many of the industrial policies like enhanced 45Q, hydrogen production incentive, what I think is really important from a low carbon feedstock standpoint, and even the 48C advanced manufacturing credit, all individually were bipartisan proposals, which gives me confidence that these policies are going to follow through over the next decade and that we're going to be able to build off them. And so as we look at these at the technology frame, I think it's important to think, those first couple bills were focused on reorienting our research, development, and demonstration structure around big goals for decarbonization. The infrastructure bill then funded those moving forward in really an unprecedented way. The infrastructure bill represented a 5x of applied research, development, and demonstration dollars at the Department of Energy, and was multi-year commitment. I know when I worked in the United States Senate, a lot of different stakeholders would come in, and we need 4-year commitment on resources, and we used to laugh, and that never happens. It's really unprecedented that we provided 5 years worth of resources for a lot of these big programs. And now we have an important 10-year tax structure in place that then can be a demand pull. So we prove out those technologies, we demonstrate them, and now we have an incentive in place to drive them forward. And so I think some really key areas where we can have collaboration. I think Republicans and Democrats can align. I think a lot of these things dated back to, frankly, Senator Whitehouse's strong efforts to move the Clean Industrial Technologies Act 4 years ago with his colleagues at the Environment and Public Works and Committee and in the Senate. And so I'm confident that we're going to build on these successes because I think it's good for the U.S. industry, it's good for climate, and it's good for global economic development as a whole. And it really capitalizes on the U.S.'s role as both a tech provider, as a first mover, and ultimately a provider of clean products to the rest of the globe.
Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Let me see. Okay, bravo. I need to spend a minute telling you what we do, because then the rest will make sense from a context perspective. So what LanzaTech does is we take waste, industrial emissions, or solid emissions like municipal solid waste, and we convert those to ethanol. We do it with a bacteria that eats hydrogen, carbon monoxide, and carbon dioxide and makes ethanol. We take that ethanol and make jet fuel, sustainable aviation fuel. We've flown a flight from Orlando to Gatwick with Virgin Atlantic made with that fuel. We have also turned that into polyester, fiber, and Zara has made dresses with that. We've made surfactants, and Unilever has made detergents with that. So why does why does the IRA matter? Why does 45Q matter? We now have incentives in the US to capture carbon oxides. That's 45Q. You get a credit for that. We have incentives for hydrogen use and production of hydrogen. That's massive for us because if we are to convert CO2, we can only do it with the addition of hydrogen. So hydrogen is an important enabler. There is funding for infrastructure And you need to stop and think about that for a second. Funding for early stage R&D is great, but every new technology needs to cross the valley of death. It needs to get to scale, which is massively expensive. Everybody wants to be first to be second. So what that means is that building the first commercial is very difficult. And so now we're starting to see in the US through the DOE and the IRA and infrastructure funding to build large manufacturing facilities, production facilities here in the US. That really, really matters because we can build the first ones here. And then the last thing that happened is the SAF credit. And that SAF credit is massive, and it really helps to equalize the cost of using fossil approaches versus using new waste approaches. And I do want to make two additional comments about policy, which I'm liking, and that is the direction towards getting a higher credit for a higher carbon reduction. That really matters because as an entry point, you can start with the least amount of life cycle reduction, and then you can work to get a bigger credit, which forces you to improve your technology rather than sitting on the first introduction. That's massive. The low carbon fuel standard is the same way. And then the last bit of the trajectory that I really like is more and more technology neutrality, focusing on emissions reduction, life cycle, not focusing on how you get from A to B. Like the renewable fuel standard in the United States actually picks technology pathways. So thank you for your leadership and the trajectory towards allowing us to scale in the United States.
Thank you so much. I'd like to follow that up thinking forward about what you all think the greatest opportunities are, either for the administration, Senator Whitehouse, you started to address this, going forward, or in Congress, and what opportunities might exist, for example, on bipartisan action. I really like the point you made, Dr. Holmgren, about the value of demonstration projects. There is considerable demonstration funding available, but when I think of the scale of the challenge, we may need more. So it'd be great if each of you could take on that question.
Back on? There we go.
Yeah.
Well, first there's a huge unknown, which is what's going to happen in Nevada and who's going to be in control of the Senate. There's even a slim chance of the House holding Democrat, so one doesn't know. That's a big question mark. Does the fossil fuel industry consider its relentless oppositional political influence stance, or do they start to moderate their behavior? That's another unknown. And does corporate America, which you've heard here, does wonderful work with supply chain and with pledges and with efficiencies, but they throw all of that to the boards when they come to Congress. And when they come to the Congress, they come to us through trade associations that either couldn't care less about climate and send a very, very deafening silence message, or are actually oppositional to us getting things done. And because of the intermediating power of those trade associations, the way they behave signals to us where corporate America really is. So those are three huge unknowns that can change the outcome of this very dramatically. With that said, I think the biggest thing that is out there is the floating EU CBAM, because that creates an international support to equalize carbon pricing so that internal advantage and disadvantage between countries gets ameliorated, and it takes away the disincentive to carbon pricing to move forward on that. So I'm urging everybody I can get in front of to look at the EU CBAM as an opportunity to don't criticize it. If you think you're going to be tariffed by it, fix your carbon output so you're not. But ideally, the EU CBAM attracts the UK, and the US and Canada and Australia, so that we all end up having a common trade platform of carbon requirements, and we don't have to deal with tariff nuisance amongst us, and everybody else in the world is urgently pressed by the economy to get right with climate. To the extent that we're aspirational, to the extent that we're eleemosynary, to the extent we're relying on good works, it's not going to work. You've got to align the economy with this. And I see the CBAM as the first big entry point to that. So, love your CBAM. Meet the CBAM where it is or make it better. And let's all do that together.
Thank you. Jeremy, take it away. And
Sure. I'm going to paint a little more of an optimistic picture of the split Congress scenario. I do think it's going to be narrow on either side, regardless of how it goes, and I think it does present a huge opportunity. More than $20 billion was allocated to the Department of Energy to do build out of infrastructure, do demonstrations on CCUS projects, build out $8 billion worth of hydrogen hubs, and we're going to have a huge permitting problem on that front. And I'm particularly worried about the U.S. Class 6 structure, which is the EPA's ability to permit and allow for secure CO2 storage, something that we're going to need for carbon removal, which is essential for climate, what we're going to need for CCUS, which is essential to the decarbonization of both the power sector and the industrial sector, and really to grow this industry as a whole. And so I do think the ability and this momentum in Congress right now on permitting as a whole, I think can be beneficial to ensuring that we're maximizing the benefits of this big policy, like the tax incentives and the DOE resources that are coming forward. I think there's a lot of interest in subsector policy as well. We saw in the CHIPS bill last year a steel sector specific policy get across the finish line. I think there's interest in the cement space, in clean heat alternatives, things along those lines where there's a significant bipartisan support. And then I think there's a big role for incentives. I mean, in many of these subsectors, these are low margin operations that have significant international competition. And so things like contracts for differences, or perhaps an incentive like Senator Whitehouse and the top Republican on the Finance Committee, Mike Crapo, who did the Energy Sector Innovation Credit on the power sector side. Maybe there's some type of policy along those lines in the industrial sector that could focus on innovative processes like Boston Metal's electrification of the steel process, things along those lines, which doesn't currently have a kind of a market pull currently in policy as a whole. And so I think those are huge opportunities. And I agree with Senator Whitehouse that the intersection of the climate and trade policy is going to increasingly become a top target or a top important issue to be addressing. There's a lot of interest, and particularly among Senate Republicans, I would say. I think a little less so on the House side on that topic. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how it evolves, and as we get closer to kind of the mid-2020s time when things move into, I think the U.S. is going to be forced to act, and I think there's going to be a reason from a competitiveness standpoint to find some type of policy that deals with these trade issues.
Okay, I'll finish off this section. First of all, I would like to see, and this is directed specifically at 45Q, right now sequestration gets a higher credit than utilization. I think if we're to incentivize a utilization industry, we need to equalize across so that we can start using CO2 to make products without paying a tax to those that want to sequester, right? That differential holds utilization back. So I think that's one important thing. The second thing I'd like to see is starting to look at the next step, which is the chemicals industry and how we help bridge that differential, because today we've been focused on fuels, and but 30% of the barrel goes to make chemicals, and so that is not an unimportant sector. I understand why we prioritized it the way we have, but I think chemicals is an important next step. And then the third thing I would say, and that's for all of us here, is we cannot let the perfect be the enemy of the good. That magical unicorn flying through the sky that's going to come and save us, it's not going to happen. We need to put our heads down and work really hard and throw everything at the problem. The things we can do today cannot be stopped, hoping that something that's going to happen tomorrow is going to appear. it takes 15 to 30 years to actually deploy new technologies, and that could be plus or minus 10 years. So if we sit around and wait, there is no hope for us. So those are my comments.
I totally appreciate that. Very, very helpful comments. I'm curious. We've heard about infrastructure and permitting. I wonder if we could just dive into that. And broadly, we're at a phase where we have incentives, we have demonstration dollars, and we need a lot of deployment. Do you all have ideas for how we can accelerate that? How we can keep support? There's certainly projects happening all across the country. Will these be supported on both sides of the aisle? Can we build momentum as we deploy?
If you look at the credit that we claim in the IRA bill for its climate provisions and how much they're going to reduce emissions, it's 15 percentage points from 25 to 40, which is real, but obviously not enough. But let's just look at that 15 for a minute. About 2/3 of that evaporates if we can't build out the new infrastructure to facilitate the clean energy transition that we are trying to fund. So it would be a really shame to spend $1/3 of $1 trillion and only get 4 or 5 percentage points worth of emissions gain. So the way to solve that and to make sure we capture at least what we've planned, which is the 15 percentage points, and perhaps push that a little bit more, is to accelerate the process of getting this infrastructure constructed. And that takes us into the question of permitting reform. And there is a lane that could be heavily bipartisan between Republicans and Democrats on permitting reform. If the deal is that big oil can build a pipeline through your backyard whenever they want to, well, that's not going to fly. There are going to need to be some real emissions windows and some environmental protections that are, baked in through all of this. But there is a pathway, and it's not a narrow pathway. I think it's actually quite a wide pathway. And being from Rhode Island, I'm particularly interested in making sure that we can accelerate the development of offshore wind. Thank you, we invented U.S. offshore wind siting and opened up this whole market, so we want to see it succeed. But we're hearing from the offshore wind companies, they're trying to work their way through BOEM and through NOAA and through the White House and through DOE and through the financing and through the labor concerns with vessel staffing and all of that. It's turning into a nightmare that's going to cause us to miss the president's goals. So there's a very particular example of a place where we need to get the permitting right in a way that protects our fishing community, that protects the oceans, but that doesn't snarl up the emergence of offshore wind as an essential component to our success.
I couldn't agree more with Senator Whitehouse, and just to give you one anecdote that I think really underscores the urgency of this issue. We're talking to an engineering firm that I won't be named that does a lot of business in the U.S. And a year and a half ago, they were working on roughly 20 CCUS projects in the United States. They told me as of a couple weeks ago, they're at 200, where there are huge opportunities. And so just the sheer influx of project interest as a result of this robust policy that we now have in place in 45Q and the big DOE resources that can finance pipelines and the project as a whole are really driving private sector interest, investment, and driving forward. And so we've got to find a path forward there. And I do think there's a sweet spot where there is a little bit of coalescing around thoughts of, all right, if we can make some sensible reforms for CO2 pipelines, for gas pipelines where appropriate in transmission, that can make a lot of sense. And can we streamline for projects, build cleaner faster? Can we streamline for projects that have significant carbon benefits that can truly ensure that we make good on these opportunities? Because I do think it is a critical moment here in the U.S. that we need to show that we can build at the scale necessary to tackle climate and ultimately use this policy opportunity to catalyze new industries, drive down the cost, and ultimately scale up decarbonization in the U.S. while providing these type of technologies to the globe. I think an issue that's at the top of mind here in this COP and particularly here in Egypt is how do we make these cleaner options more affordable? for the developing world as well. And I think that's an important place and a role that the U.S. has over the next decade as a technology builder and demonstrator.
So to the topics of finance and permitting, the permitting one is in my mind, I think the thing that we need to do, and smarter people than I know about permitting, but I would say we need to make sure that it isn't that much harder to permit a greenfield site as opposed to a brownfield site. Because if we really want to grow an economy, a new carbon economy, we need to make the construction, the infrastructure funds available to people that aren't necessarily currently in an industrial location. Because the reality is, where is the future industry? Where is the future carbon economy? It may not be in the same place as it is now. So we need to make sure they can go fast also. When it comes to financing, the risk premium is massive. So you spoke about the risk premium for somebody in the global south, shall we say, to build a project versus building it in Los Angeles. And what I focus on is the risk premium of the first of a kind technology. When you build a commercial demo, and that's what they really are, is the first of a kind commercial is really a commercial demo, it's very hard to pull together the financing. For LanzaJet, I'll give you an example. We're building a 10 million gallon a year commercial demo SAF production. That plan, the way we got the debt for it is shareholder loans. The shareholders get much cheaper debt than we do because they're Shell, Suncor, Mitsui, and British Airways. Okay, the rest of the financing on the debt side came from Breakthrough Energy Catalyst, which is basically a philanthropic fund that is giving grants. Philanthropy isn't going to get this done. I do appreciate what they're doing for us, but it's not going to get it done. And the third leg of that stool came from Microsoft's Climate Fund. And so those are the people, the folks that stepped up. Now, fundamental to that is work that we've done with the Department of Energy. They gave us a grant, etc. But understand that then you still needed to get the debt. And a company that's building a first commercial, especially a startup company, I mean, walk into a bank and get laughed right out of the room. So loan guarantees help, but we need more than that. So
That's an extremely helpful perspective for us, Dr. Holmgren. I'd be interested when we think about making the project economics work, and we think about we've heard about CBAM as an option. I assume that your sustainable aviation fuel, there'll be a better market for it. I'm interested in whether the market drivers for cleaner products, we think those will be there in a significant way. Are there measures we can take to enhance that? There are ideas about clean procurement. I'm interested in what you all think about whether that's bankable enough to get projects started. And if given the time, I'll just lay in another question on the demonstrations. Can we get more revenue there? If we can't, there's the other side is costs. Can we use demonstration projects to bring more emitters down into the range where the tax credit does the work for them? Do we think that's going to work? How do we enhance uptake of this by ensuring that we have as much revenue that the economics, just to Dr. Holmgren's points, work out for as many projects as possible?
We've been engaged in feedback avoidance. I hope you appreciate this little delay. I can't answer the second question. I'm not expert. Lanza would be much better at having lived, that lived experience. More clear path is the voice of people who are living that experience. But I'm watching with real interest what I think is going to be a fascinating experiment as this $120 per ton carbon price in the form of a social cost of carbon rolls out. It's going to be a while before it's operational. First, the EPA regulation has to pass and become effective. And then if it's going to go beyond EPA, because that's all the EPA has jurisdiction over is itself, then the Office of Management and Budget is going to have to step in and figure out how you expand it. So all of this is going to take a little bit of time. But industries plan and businesses plan, and well ahead of that $120 per ton going live in a lot of areas, particularly procurement, which you mentioned. It's going to be really interesting to see how big vendors to the U.S. government begin to adapt now to prepare themselves for a procurement world in which the procurement decision bakes in a $120 per ton cost of carbon for greenhouse gases. And if, as I suspect is going to be the case, the market moves quite rapidly, that's going to be a very good sign, because a lot of our planning has been based on when things go into effect. And market movement ahead of deadline, if you will, is hard to predict. But that could be really, really significant. I think this $120 per ton carbon price could be a very, very big thing. And then the other big one out there, of course, the CBAM, is companies beginning to plan for that, even if it's 4 or 6 years hence. And that, I think, that's just a big unknown. But I think that the capacity for business to plan ahead and to prepare for predicted or known eventualities is going to drive a lot of this benefit far forward towards us.
In the short term, I think it's going to be really important that there's either an incentive structure in place, whether it's a tax incentive or a contract for differences. I think federal procurement's going to be a big piece of the puzzle as well. Because in the end, there's intense global competition. I'll just using steel as an example, and it's low margin. And frankly, the global financial markets are not cooking in the green premium and focusing on that. And the developing world doesn't have that luxury to pay that. And what would be a shame is if we disadvantage the U.S. industry in the global marketplace, and then that got filled by China, who significantly higher carbon intense steel producer. And so I think it's really important to bridge that cost gap, particularly in the short term, at home, so we can catalyze this industry. And I do think policies in the U.S., as Senator Whitehouse mentions, or the EU CBAM, things like that, that will largely change the financial markets. But I'm worried that that's not going to happen fast enough, at least in the short term, while we're trying to maximize the opportunity when we're making these big investments in new technologies and commercially demonstrating and deploying them.
Bankable projects, my favorite word. Let's be clear. For a small company startup, there is no project that is bankable, okay? Just so we're absolutely clear. Getting 1 billion gallons of secured offtake is great, but it doesn't help you get cheap debt. Of course it's bankable, but it's bankable at a very high premium, okay? And so I'll start adding $1 a gallon, okay, to the price of my fuel, because I've got a 12% interest rate or a 10% interest rate, which is why the loan guarantees matter. And I know I was being provocative with the way I said it, but because of that, one of the things we've done is ANA, for example, for LanzaJet, we got a prepaid offtake agreement. They gave us the money up front, and the reason they did that is to help us build the plant. We need dollars to put steel in the ground, and so having an offtake will help us. But again, at the end of the day, what matters is the interest rate on the loan. That's what I care about, is to make it as cheap as possible, so that when people ask me, are we competitive with the price of petroleum kerosene, and I show that I'm $1 higher than I will be when I build the second plant, people look at that and say, well, that's reasonable because that's just dead. It would be a lot easier to be 30 cents more because I got cheap debt, then people will believe that I am literally 30 cents away, not $1 away. So I'll keep saying the same thing. It's getting the debt at a lower rate really helps create these industries and build the first ones.
That's extremely helpful. One question, just picking up on the question of interest rates, which gets me to inflation, which gets me to one issue we've been concerned about with some of the tax credits, including 45Q, which is not inflation adjusted until 2027, based on 2025 as the year at which the adjustment begins. I'd be interested if you all think there are any opportunities to fix that and get it inflation adjusted now. The original premise and analyses for the $85 reflected an earlier period of time when inflation was not as much of an issue, and would just love thoughts on the relevance of that as we work to a close. So,
Well, as somebody who started at ground zero with 45Q and got it passed and then has been through the iterations of it, it has been a constant moving project with a lot of live scrutiny of it and a lot of continuing effort to fix it and get it right, with the next step being what we call the parity measure between sequestration and utilization. And as that process continues, if inflation continues to be an issue, then we're going to want to make that adjustment as well. But this is a very lively, continuing process legislatively, rather than an ossified stake in the ground, come back and revisit it in a decade. And I think that's been one of the values of it.
I would completely agree with the senator, and I think there's some huge opportunities because I think there's interest on the carbon removal side as well of a more technology neutral incentive in place. The existing 45Q really is beneficial for direct air capture. It was a huge policy bump for it, and I think is going to drive projects. And so I think there can be a merging of Republicans who are looking to spur this industry moving forward, and folks who are concerned about climate and environmental reasons on the right and on the left that could yield another one of these big wins, as we've effectively amended 45Q every Congress or every other Congress for the last 4.
No, I don't have anything to add other than to thank you for 45Q.
One last point as we close out, because it's something that we're going to hear here a lot, which is that this carbon removal technology, in my view, is absolutely essential, because we are going to fail at 1.5 degrees. And once you have failed, then net zero doesn't save you. You actually have to go back and extract carbon out of the atmosphere. So getting these technologies in place so that it can be done is absolutely vital. But there is a very proper criticism of carbon removal if it turns into an excuse to continue carbon pollution. We've got to keep our eye on the ultimate target, and it's going to be the same technology, whether it's used to save us or whether it's used as an excuse to continue to pollute. So the technology can't fix this. Our aspirations and our commitments as human beings are going to be what fixes this, and we've got to make absolutely sure that we are going forward, all hands on deck, so that we solve this problem and do not let carbon sequestration or carbon utilization be an excuse to take our foot off the accelerator pedal on all of these other strategies for driving carbon emissions out of our world.
thank you. I'd perhaps invite you all to just make any concluding remarks, if you have them, Senator Whitehouse. If that was yours.
Those were them.
Okay.
I would say there's just huge opportunity. The debate in Washington, D.C. has shifted on solutions, and I think particularly in the industrial space, there is both a political, economic, and environmental reason to drive forward and continue to build on successes. And so I think you're going to see sustained U.S. federal policy in this space to drive industrial decarbonization.
I guess I would finish with, we live in an amazing time. We are here all to develop a new carbon economy. Imagine that opportunity. Imagine the jobs. Imagine the ability to change everything. And I would ask you to just see how each of us can participate. Technology, government, NGOs, and everybody, communicators, all of you can contribute, all of us can contribute, but we need to go really fast, and we need to avoid calls to inaction. This technology is a call to inaction, or anything that, as you say, takes our foot off the pedal will be very bad. Every single carbon atom we save is really, really important. So let's get on to doing it.
Thank you so much. I couldn't have ended on a better note, and welcome everyone to thank the panel.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming. We're at the Clean Air Task Force's Zero Carbon Futures Pavilion at COP27. And this is a panel on the policies helping to decarbonize the power grid. And the last 2 years have really been transformational for the policy framework for U.S. Power. The Biden administration entered office with a plan to coordinate the implementation, as I understand it, of a variety of rules that apply to fossil fuels power, not just for carbon, but for smog and soot and toxic emissions and pollution that gets into the water and coal ash. And then that approach was followed up by a huge investment in clean energy last summer when the Inflation Reduction Act was enacted. That's $369 billion for a variety of investments and incentives, including for green power. And now Democrats have the task, perhaps, of advancing legislation that would make it easier to permit and cite all the infrastructure that is needed to get the biggest bang for the buck with the IRA, and perhaps doing it with the hope that it doesn't make it easy to build pipelines and other fossil fuels infrastructure without environmental review and buy-in from local communities. So President Biden has committed to cutting greenhouse gases from the power sector by 80% by the end of this decade, and decarbonizing it completely by 2035. And this panel, I was going to say, has two of the policy leaders who will make that a reality, but that is no longer the case because actually we have three members of the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, which I didn't know was going to happen when I was putting this together. And then also a leader from the industry that will have a role in implementing all these policies, or in providing green power. So Ali Zaidi helped craft the Biden administration's, or the Biden transition team's strategy on climate change, including power. And he was deputy to the National Security Council, National Climate Advisor Gina McCarthy, while the White House was working on what became the Inflation Reduction Act, and also putting in place a whole of government approach to climate policy at a variety of agencies. And then now, just a couple of months ago, he became the National Climate Advisor as the IRA enters its implementation phase and as we're all waiting for some of the most important rules to come out. And then Congresswoman Kathy Castor is the chair of the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis and a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee. And then before she was elected to her district in Florida, she was a county commissioner, and she was the chair of the county's Environmental Protection Commission. So she has history and experience implementing the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act from a local government's perspective, which we'll draw on. And then Caroline Chow. Oh, and she is joined by Congressman Sean Casten from Illinois and Congresswoman Suzanne Bonamici from Oregon, who are also members of the Select Committee and members of a delegation that is here at COP this weekend. Caroline Chow is Senior Vice President of Corporate Affairs at the Southern California Edison and its parent company, Edison International. And she served as Vice President for Regulatory Affairs at Southern California Edison and has extensive experience in issues of environmental permitting, compliance, and policy. So this is a great panel. These are the people I'd call if I were writing a piece, really, on the future of power sector policy and climate change. So we'll start with Ollie. E&E News and others have reported that really from the beginning of the administration, there was this idea of taking a comprehensive approach to regulation of power plants, not just the carbon rules that we'll see in the first quarter of next year, but also all of these other rules that from the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act that will have an effect on fossil fuels power plants and also on the emissions that this whole sector provides. So I would love your view on how the Biden administration sees all of these rules working together to influence the kinds of power plants that are still running in the U.S. and the carbon emissions that they are emitting.
Great, and it's good to be on a panel with three folks who voted to make history. And I know that's not easy, and just really grateful for their leadership in getting us to where we are at this moment. The President was clear on day one of his administration that this would be an administration that listened to the science and that implemented the law of the land, which, by the way, was in stark contrast to what had been going on. I think in terms of what we broadcast from day one, what we were clear about is we understand the sources of risk to our communities and to the public health of our people. We understand the sources of risk to our environment and our ability to prosper here on planet Earth. And science informs that, right? Science helps us understand how particulate matters that form as a result of certain processes, industrial processes, can lead to increased asthma attacks and heart attacks and cardiovascular issues, shorten lifespans and take people out of work. And so, same with other sources of pollution and toxics. And so from day one, the administration has been pursuing across media and across sources of pollution an effort to make sure that we are implementing, I know we're talking a lot about implementing the Inflation Reduction Act these days, but implementing the stuff that was passed 4 decades ago. And by the way, that Clean Air Act and that Clean Water Act have helped us grow our economy and strengthen our public health. So, I think thing number one is, we have been laser focused through not just the Environmental Protection Agency, but through all of our agencies in promoting public health, promoting public safety, cleaning up our air and cleaning up our water, because that's what the American people deserve and that's what the President ran on. Now, what we also know is that's going to be interactive with trends in the marketplace, trends in technology availability. What we had available to us 20 or 30 years ago is now what we have available to us today. Just take a simple example of diesel buses, right? So, 20 years ago, if we're staring at a school bus that's spewing out fumes, maybe we think, gee, there aren't a bunch of really great alternatives that we have. Today, thanks in part to the bipartisan infrastructure law, which, by the way, the really, really big historic bill that the President got through Congress before he got another really, really big historic bill through Congress, is delivering literally clean buses to communities all around the country. So, I think what hopefully folks have come to expect from the Biden administration And what I would expect going forward is listen to the science, implement the law, lift up our communities, do the hard work of repair and rebuilding in communities left out and left behind, and do it all in a way that seizes this tremendous economic opportunity that we have available to us because of the technological innovation that used to happen in our labs now can be happening on the shop floor.
Great, thanks. So this is originally for Congresswoman Castor, but I'll open it up to all the lawmakers on this panel. Obviously, we're waiting to find out what happens after Tuesday's midterm election, but in the event that Republicans seize a very slim majority in the House, they've signaled that they already have plans to step up oversight not only of regulation, like the EPA regulations, but also of the Inflation Reduction Act as it is implemented. And there's been talk of trying to identify a new Solyndra, Solyndra being the solar panel manufacturer that was a real focus of scrutiny after it went bankrupt, after it got some support from the Department of Energy back under Obama. So if the House does change hands, what can a small Republican majority do to complicate EPA's ability to regulate power plants or to stymie implementation of the IRA? And what can Democrats do to keep that from happening?
Let the chair start. Great. Well, thank you, Jean. It's a pleasure to be with you and with Allie and Caroline, too. And I'm thrilled that my colleagues, real climate champions, Congressman Sean Casten and Congresswoman Suzanne Bonamici are here to join us. And our brilliant staff director, Anna Unruh-Cohn, is in the front. And together, you all are aware that it was the Select Committee appointed by Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who's always had climate as one of her flagship issues. We compiled, we took in input from stakeholders to meet the scientific imperative, heard from youth activists, entrepreneurs, folks in industry, climate justice advocates, and issued the Climate Crisis Action Plan a couple of years ago that became the basis of many of the policies in the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And following, it was really the Democrats that delivered on President Biden's ambitious goal, his climate goal to cut greenhouse gas pollution by 50% by 2030, and we now are well on our way to doing that. So your question is, you all following the election in the United States of America is rather a surprise, right? With crushing higher costs for my neighbors back home, everyone, exacerbated by Putin's unprovoked aggression on Russia. Now, everyone anticipated, wow, this was going to be a red wave. That did not materialize, and I think, in part, it's because of what we have been able to deliver on climate action, on jobs, on investments in infrastructure, and powered by young people, Gen Z and millennials that know what is at stake and want a livable planet. So what we anticipate from the Republicans is probably more of the same. Unfortunately, they do not have a plan at all for climate. So yes, they will default into defense of fossil fuel industry, and it's going to be very interesting as we teeter here. It looks like the Senate will remain in Democratic control. So you're right, they're not going to be able to nick away at these grand accomplishments. Remember, the infrastructure law was bipartisan. So we're ready for oversight. We have John Podesta now as implementing kind of the oversight role. We've got fantastic leaders at the Department of Energy, the EPA, all across the agencies. FERC is still proactive. And we have partnerships with the industry and climate justice advocates. And I think we're ready to fight for a livable planet and a clean and healthy future. And thank goodness that the United States of America can arrive here at the COP with the most historic investment in clean energy and climate action in history. So we're excited. Bring on the debates.
And if I could just add, is this on?
I don't know.
Thank you. I'll just add a couple of thank you to the chair. Thank you all for being here today. It's an honor to serve on the Select Committee with Chair Castor. I also serve on the House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology and the Committee on Education and Workforce. And yes, there will be, if the Republicans take the majority, it'll be a very slim majority. I've served in the minority on the Science Committee as well. There are places where, of course, we'll fight the oversight efforts, and as it turns out, people actually like democracy, which is, I think, the reason why the election is turning out the way it is. But there are many places where we can continue to move forward. For example, there was also the CHIPS and Science Act with bipartisan support, and a lot of that went through the Science, Space, and Technology Committee. The and science part is about investments in the National Science Foundation and NIST and the Department of Energy's Office of Science. So there's a lot of places where we can still continue moving forward and making progress, even with a slight Republican majority. But I'm hopeful that doesn't happen. There's still a lot up in the air. And I wanted to mention as well, it looks like the Democrats will hold the Senate. We need to be concerned about what happens in the judicial realm as well. When we see the cases that have gone up through the court system, ultimately at the Supreme Court, not particularly beneficial for the environment. So we hope that the Senate holds and that they can continue filling the judicial seats with actual justices who believe in science. So that's my 2 cents. I'll pass it over to Sean Caston for his input.
So I'll try to be brief, and thank you so much for having us and being flexible in your presentation. I think something that is worth talking about at COP for how this affects the rest of the world is that we talk about this as a Republican-Democratic divide because that's how our form of government works. It is really an urban-rural divide because the parts of the United States that are rural, that depend on energy extraction, tend to be represented by Republicans. The parts of the United States that's where our economy is concentrated, where people benefit from having access to cheap energy, tend to be represented by Democrats. And because what we did in the Inflation Reduction Act was not based on putting penalties on the bad guys, it was based on creating incentives to deploy cheap energy. I said cheap, I didn't say clean, but those two things are synonymous. And so the pushback we have, if you will, is from members of Congress who are looking out for the interests of their communities and saying, if we deploy solar energy, if we deploy electric vehicles, if we deploy geothermal, if we deploy nuclear, if we deploy wind, all of these things have the practical effect of giving every American access to cheaper energy and decimating the oil and gas sector, decimating the coal sector because they are not providing a competitive product. And so on the Financial Services Committee I sit on, my colleagues are eager to, and are already creating a lot of noise, to block banks from making capitalistic decisions to preferentially invest in technologies that are growing, and they're calling it woke capitalism. Woke capitalism is capitalism that you don't like. That's all it is, right? But we're already seeing them put a real scramble that's creating certain states, certain pension funds are now causing some of the banks to freeze, and we need that private capital to come through. We'll work, we'll push back, I'm optimistic. But I frame it that way because as we are in an international world, the opportunity and the amazing opportunity of clean energy is that it's cheap. The amazing challenge is that it leaves behind people who have built a generation, built communities, built families in the provision of expensive energy. And we have to figure out how to make sure that this expanded pie that we're creating leaves them a slice as well.
And as I pass the microphone back, I want to add to Rep. Caston's comment that's why the workforce piece is so important. As we transition away from fossil fuels, we need to make sure that there are jobs there for people who work in those industries now, and that's a tremendous part of it as well.
Great, thanks. Caroline, it's great to have a utility sector voice on this panel too. As you know, analyses have started to come in about how the U.S. could reach its 2030 target of cutting emissions at least in half. And that'll rest heavily on the power sector, because the power sector is the second most emitting sector in the U.S. economy. And one of those analyses by America is All In, and Gina McCarthy was actually on the call introducing this report the other day, had some pretty ambitious assumptions for how you get there. Things like there won't be any unabated coal by 2030, just a real transformation of the sector writ large. I wonder if those assumptions are realistic from your point of view, and how quickly is that going to happen?
So, great question. I think the power sector, of course, has been leading the way in the emissions reductions in the United States so far, and has achieved significant reductions already. So we do, and I think we are poised to have additional significant reductions, particularly as you look at individual companies. Certainly at Edison in California, we've been at it for a longer time than some of the other states. And so for Southern California Edison, we have no coal in our portfolio already today. And we have less natural gas than many of our peer utilities. So it's a matter of planning for those investments that will have to be made to replace those coal and other fossil investments, and having adequate time to prepare. I think in a number of cases, you're already seeing a number of utilities make those announcements of coal retirements, replacing with some backfill with natural gas, but a number of them in making investments in renewable energy. You know, at Southern California Edison, we are well on our way to 100% renewable energy, over 40% today, on our way to 100% by 2045, with an 80% milestone by 2030, so only 8 years from now. And we see the opportunity. I mean, you've seen the costs drop significantly over the last several years in both solar and wind. In California, we also now have an offshore wind target to try and shoot for. Not a mandate, but as part of the 100%, we see great opportunity for that. Additional geothermal. Hydropower, we're not sure. We have significant hydropower already in California. Not sure we'll see additional additions to hydropower. But we do see great opportunities, that as well as storage. I mean, the pathway in California that Southern California Edison put together shows that to hit carbon neutrality by 2045, we need an additional 80 gigawatts of large-scale generation. In addition to 30 gigawatts of behind the meter, which will mostly be solar rooftops. We expect half the rooftops in California to have solar power on it by 2045. And that's going to be paired with energy storage. So 30 gigawatts of large-scale energy storage with 10 gigawatts of behind-the-meter, again, residential and business storage. So it is possible. You have to plan for it. You have to work with your commissions, at least at the utility level, work with your utility commissions about those investments that are going to be necessary, but it's definitely achievable.
Thank you. So Ollie, another one for you. We should talk a little bit about the upcoming proposals for new and existing power plant carbon, which I understand are due early next year from EPA. You know, the Supreme Court had a major ruling this year, West Virginia versus EPA, that reduced the tools that EPA has in its toolbox to regulate power plant carbon. So I'm curious, you know, what can we expect from this new set of regulations? And also there was that white paper that EPA put out this year that again raised some really aggressive possibilities for especially new gas plant regulation. Things like the use of hydrogen to reduce emissions, or carbon capture and storage at new gas-fired power plants. Could those make it into a new source review, you know, new source performance standard for gas plants?
So first of all, and Gene knows this, but let me make sure everyone else understands too. The way EPA develops rules is they put out a proposed rule. Okay, all right. Can you hear me? Okay. That's the EPA sound. Um, just kidding. Just process-wise, just so everyone understands, EPA puts out a proposed rule. The whole world and their mother comments on it. The technical experts of EPA comb through those, and then they issue final rules. For reasons of integrity of that process, I'm not going to sit here and pontificate on what's going to be in the proposal, because that's EPA's work to do on a technical basis, and then all of us will get to comment on it, which will be an exciting endeavor. I think it's important to maybe make sure we level set on what the Supreme Court did or did not do. It did not take tools away. It did constrain the use of tools, but in doing so, I think recognized that there's pollution out there. That pollution is causing the earth to warm, and the Environmental Protection Agency ought to do something about it under the Clean Air Act. So I think that's really meaningful. The second thing you talked about was a white paper that EPA issued, which really, and this is, I think, pretty interesting. The white paper came out in the springtime, and what's remarkable about the moment that we're in the power sector is every quarter the technology advances more and more. So by the time that paper probably came out, the marketplace had probably cruised ahead of that. And what we're seeing around the country now is folks taking old power plant assets and repowering them. Hydrogen repowered power plants is not a concept in an EPA document. It's a real life reality in New Mexico and other places. We are seeing very high capacity factor renewables become a material reality. The president hosted a bunch of folks at the White House around offshore wind. We have a lot of reasons to like offshore wind, including, by the way, the steel and cement jobs that they create. Every 1 megawatt of wind is 500 tons of steel, and if that's sourced in America, that's jobs for union workers. But the other reason I think we're really excited about offshore wind is the high capacity factor. Based on analysis that has been done primarily in Europe, the capacity factors for offshore wind parallel or are around the same level as capacity factors from coal plants on the European continent. So we're talking about a new technology opportunity set, and I've talked about how the technology landscape's changed since the spring. Now go back in time to the Clean Power Plan and think about how much the technology's changed since then. So sure, some of the tools may have been constrained from a regulatory perspective, but think about the leapfrogging that's happened in terms of the availability of technology that's cost effective, not only cost effective, that will reduce cost. To Representative Caston's point, that is cheaper today. So look, as I said at the outset, this administration is one that is focused on listening to and heeding the science. That's climate science, that's public health science, and that's science and technology. We've got the technology to cut emissions, to improve public health, and we're going to get after it. And by the way, now Congress has given us the tools to unlock the full economic upside of what it means to go to clean energy. This means jobs for electricians. It means jobs for welders. It means jobs for the manufacturing supply chain, for the steel input materials, for the folks who are going to work in recycling and the circular economy and the sourcing of critical materials. So we have nothing but enthusiasm for the opportunity in front of us to seize the shift to cleaner electricity.
And Caroline, actually, could I just get you on the idea of a rule that would take advantage of hydrogen or CCS for new gas plants? You say, I think you have some gas plants in your portfolio, but you also have great knowledge of the grid in general and of other companies and what they have. Would that kind of rule be feasible? What would be the limitations about siting, for CCS, and
Yeah.
what are your thoughts?
So, I mean, as you know, utilities are definitely implementers of public policy, and we worked to shape that policy. We had concerns about beyond the fence line type of regulation as part of a power plant emissions rule. We'll be watching carefully on what the details are of this new rule that Ali mentioned. I think we do see great opportunity for CCS. I think the siting is going to be one challenge. The cost will be another challenge. And also some limitations. So even in California, our pathway had over 100 million tons to be sequestered, but now state law has really narrowed the opportunity for what can be sequestered, really seeking to have more direct emission reductions happen as part of the mitigation planning in California. So I think the devil will be in the details, as they always are, to see how that rule comes out and whether it will be feasible for the utility industry to achieve it.
Thank you. So, Congresswoman Castor, I wanted to take advantage of the fact that you have this expertise in local government as well as national government. And I know that the delegation has been talking a lot about the IRA and its potential to cut emissions by a gigaton, I think, by 2030. I'm not sure what the date on that is. But a lot of that, some of that is incentives, but a lot of that depends on money that flows through state and local governments. And the same is true for the bipartisan infrastructure law. A lot of that money passes through local agencies who spend it on projects. So I wonder, what safeguards are built into those laws to make sure that the money is spent, as Congress intended, both from a climate perspective and also making sure that resources are made available to communities that have been disadvantaged in the past and not seen their fair share of investment. And then if you were advising John Podesta, who is the White House lead on implementation of the IRA, what would you say he should do to make sure that the money goes where it's supposed to go?
That's great. Just reflecting on how you started with the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, I remember as a child in the early 1970s growing up in Tampa, Florida, where they were dumping wastewater directly into Tampa Bay, and it was the Clean Water Act and EPA direct grants to local communities, to the city of Tampa and Hillsborough County, that cleaned up Tampa Bay. The seagrass is recovered, and it's a fantastic place. Then the Clean Air Act, I remember you'd wake up on certain mornings, and if the wind was blowing from the east, all of the industrial, you could smell industry, even though you lived in the suburbs. And the Clean Air Act, over time, cleaned the air. But now with the impacts of climate change, it's a whole different ballgame. So we were very focused in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and in the IRA to ensuring that local communities, especially communities that have long carried the burden of pollution, get the tools they need directly to decrease their emissions, to monitor what's in the air and water, to actually do that next generation of the water and wastewater treatment cleanups. And those dollars, thankfully, we have people committed through the Biden administration who have said they are committed to at least 40% of those grants going to the communities that are often left behind. One of the challenges is going to be building capacity in communities that don't have the planners, they don't have the engineers, they don't have the money to hire the consultants to go fight for grants. And talking with Michael Regan from the EPA this week here at the COP, he said, I've got an oversight committee of 200 activists, environmental justice activists, local grassroots activists who are going to keep a good eye. Now, through the through the Inflation Reduction Act, remember that came through this technical reconciliation. So that you don't get to legislate a lot on that. So we don't put guardrails on tax credits. There's some on grant initiatives that currently exist, Clean Water and others. But it's largely going to be up to the administration as those monies flow out the door. For example, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund is a $27 billion Green Bank initiative looking for creative projects across the country to lower emissions that in partnership with industry, but really looking for the new technologies that can make an impact right away. And folks are going to be very keen on watching how those monies roll out.
I'm not sure what your backgrounds are in local government, but if you have thoughts on sort of making sure that this money is spent, in accordance with the will of Congress.
I think Kathy's exactly right that because of the reconciliation process, this is going to be done to the White House. The back part of your question is what would I like to see John Podesta focus on? So, Ollie, I'll let you take this back. For us to realize the benefits of the IRA, the modeling we have that says that we're going to lower CO2 emissions by 40% by 2030, these amazing numbers. Nested within that is an implicit assumption that we are going to build transmission in the United States at an annual rate that's about 5 times as fast as we are historically building it. And that's a whole nested issue of state and local permitting challenges. This is dirty little secret. It's really easy to build a gas pipeline in the United States. It's really hard to build a transmission wire. And the proof of the pudding of that is that we have about 1,000 gigawatts of generation in the United States. There are currently 1,000 gigawatts of generation in the queue waiting to be built. Of that, 950 of it is zero carbon generation. 50 is fossil fuel. It's easy to build the fossil stuff. That's not where the problem is. It's how do we get the state and municipal laws to make it easier to build the transmission, because if we're building generation where the sun is, where the wind is, where the geothermal is, and we're building loads where the electric vehicle charging stations are, where the new factory is, we've got to get the wires to get it there, and that's going to take a whole of government. When I say whole of government, I mean state, local, federal approach. Yeah. And I see that the utility expert will hopefully agree with that.
I absolutely agree with you that the transmission line challenge is huge, and I think we average around 11 to 15 years to build a transmission line, of which maybe 2 is the construction. Right, so that just tells you how much complexity there is in the permitting and the challenges to the permits that then are received to getting these construction projects done. So to try and quintuple the rate of transmission project development is going to be a significant challenge, and one that I think in this next policy discussion that hopefully the House has and the Senate in terms of permitting reforms to really streamline that process at the federal level as we work together to do that at the state and local level as well.
What are prospects for permitting reform at this point? Is it very important to get it before there are potentially changes in?
Yeah, I'm going to let Sean answer that because we've had many conversations about it, particularly in this select.
You look like you had a.
Kathy?
Well, I'll just, permitting reform means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and Rep. Kasten and I especially, I'm not exactly sure where Rep. Bonamici falls, but I think we desperately need permitting reform for the power sector, for the siting of transmission lines, because we're in a climate crisis. And we must act with urgency. We are running out of time. All of the world's top scientists say we have a rapidly closing window. We don't have time for 11 years to build transmission to bring renewables on. But if they're talking permitting reform at gutting our bedrock environmental protections in NEPA and clean water and clean air, then there's very little appetite for that piece. So that's the quandary that we're in, or the challenge, or the opportunity.
And I'll just agree with Chair Castor on that. And look at the magnitude of the work that Representative Kasten noted. There's a tremendous amount of work to be done. So the workforce piece comes in again. Even if we got permitting for them, we're not going to build the grid if we don't have the people with the skills to do the job. So that's another piece that I know we'll continue to work on as well. I just in Oregon visited with a nonprofit organization called Constructing Hope, and we have Oregon tradeswomen and these organizations that are really reaching out with pre-apprenticeship programs and apprenticeship programs and trying to get people into the historically left behind, especially into to good jobs where they can make a good family wage and have retirement savings. We need people to get to do all this work that we have the funding. Assuming we get the permitting reform, we need the workforce to do it.
Yeah, and I'll just add on this too. In the Inflation Reduction Act, there are significant new dollars to go to the agencies that conduct these environmental reviews. So a lot of what I hear from my Republican colleagues is, oh, it's a morass, it takes too long, we can't get through. But then they won't fund those environmental reviews at the agencies. So now we have provided resources to speed up environmental reviews and directed monies to do the early planning that we need on the transmission siting across the country and addressing what is caught in the interregional queues. So that's a hope. I wanted to leave on a hopeful note on permitting.
No, sorry, just to get back to the politics of a permitting bill, though. Is there potential for a bargain, like a grand bargain between Democrats and Republicans if there is a, yeah, okay.
So I want to be hopeful, but I also want to be realistic about this, and it goes to what I said at the start, that the Republican Party primarily represents the interests of energy and extractive industries. And so the path to a permitting bill, if the question was, how do we look out for the interests of the American people, then we do transmission reform because that helps us bring clean energy forward and the American people will benefit. If we say, how do we look out for the interests of the energy extractive regions of the country, then we say, let's get rid of NEPA reform and let's focus on oil and gas permitting to make it easier to leave big holes in the ground, put a lot of pollution in the air, and run a pipeline, across your community. It is not clear as we sit here right now that the path to getting a permitting reform bill through the Senate, and Senator Whitehouse isn't here anymore, so I can say this, the Senate is not designed to represent the American people. It's designed to represent states. In the path to getting a bill through the Senate, it is hard to see that you get enough votes without putting a lot of oil and gas provisions in there. On the flip side, getting a permitting bill that gets through the body that is designed to represent the interests of the American people has to be very transmission heavy. And trying to figure out in the current moment where that Venn diagram overlaps is a little tricky.
Good. You mentioned Senator Whitehouse, and he frequently says that that industry, that business, has a role to play in putting pressure, especially on Republicans, to enact climate policy, to either not really challenge regulations or else to actually do something towards pricing carbon. And there was an example this year of a policy that industry really backed, put a lot of money into, and lobbying and earnestly pursued, that passed in the form of the Kigali Amendment. The cooling and chemicals industry were very behind and really devoted political capital to ratification of the Kigali Amendment on HFCs, and it happened even with a harder threshold with joining a treaty. So from Caroline, I'm curious, what is the potential for the power sector, for utilities, to back some kind of a climate bill in the future? And what would have to happen for them to think that that was a good idea for them to do? And what would it look like?
So is this just about permitting reform or a broader?
Well, it could be permitting reform, but I was thinking, could there ever be appetite for a renewable energy standard or a clean energy standard, and what kinds of things would have to happen for that to look like a good deal?
Well, I do think that the industry has been negotiating around sort of a clean energy standard, or what was the clean energy performance something, SEP, yeah. So I do think that is possible. You've seen a number of the industry move towards renewable energy. Much of it may be driven by their states. A number of more states have adopted renewable portfolio standards. California has 100% eventually, but you have some that have started at, California started at 20%. and now it's at 100%, because as we moved down the path towards 20 and saw that it was going to be achievable, they moved the goalposts and moved the timeframes out. And so, you have 20%, and now we have a 50%, and then, 80, and then 100%. So over the next several decades to get to 2045 at 100%. I do think at a federal level, we would like to see that happen. We do like standardization. We do think it would be helpful. But again, the devil is in the details around how that gets implemented and what the cost is. The power sector is really critical to the country achieving the climate goals. But it needs to be an economy-wide approach. And as you think about an economy-wide approach, what is that cost of that next ton of carbon? Is it to take it out of the power sector, or is it to take it out of some other part of the economy in order to maintain the lowest cost approach to achieving the climate objectives?
Okay, and so Ollie, I'll give you the last question, and then we'll wrap this up. So there's been so much focus on the IRA, and I know that was one of the main things that the Biden administration brought to this COP, and that he talked about, and that's one of the main ways that the U.S. is going to meet its NDC. And I hear I hear a fair amount of enthusiasm here at COP for the Inflation Reduction Act, but there's also concern, especially about some of the domestic components rules for some of the incentives. The European Union has raised concern about that. I've heard it from some developing countries as well. And also it didn't include sort of international finance for folks, and that's a main issue here. What are your kind of communications with other delegations here about that? And is there potential for the IRA to advantage other countries? I mean, how do you see it improving the lives of people around the world, or their ability to bring renewable energy online, or to reduce their emissions?
Well, one of my favorite sermons from Dr. King, he talks about Schubert's Unfinished Symphony, and this work that we embark on, where we pour all of our labor and sweat and tears into building a more just society, and the work isn't finished. And I think that, I remember last year's COP, and we came in and people said, well, Biden set all these goals, will Congress be able to do anything? Anything at all? That's what a bunch of folks said. And then we passed the infrastructure law. And then we passed the Inflation Reduction Act. And then we ratified the Kigali Amendment. And is the temple built? No, it's not. There is a lot of work that we're going to have to do to build the just and sustainable and fair society. And it's not just going to be work that's even completed in one generation. We will have to keep at it. And there will be headwinds, and there will be moments where it feels like backsliding is possible. And I think we're going to have to bring all of us together, leaning in and making sure that does not take place. I think the conversation I'm having with folks from other delegations is a conversation about how we actually were able to come back at this conference a year later and deliver on the things that we said we would. And by the way, advance investments into resilience and adaptation, an effort under Prepare that's going to help 500 million people around the world live with greater adaptation support. An investment, the first into the Adaptation Fund by the Biden administration. $2.3 billion mobilized by the Development Finance Corporation to help not only deploy clean energy in the developing world, but help build the capacity to manufacture it in the first place. Is the work done? Absolutely not. And I think the conversations I hear with folks from other delegations acknowledges that fact. But I think the other thing that I'm hearing folks acknowledge is that we've got good reason to be hopeful right now. I was talking to young people from other parts of the world who are, for the first time in a while, maybe in their lifetimes, looking at the United States and thinking, gee, my country should be doing more on climate like that. So, look, I think there's work to be done to close the gap to 50 to 52%. We're doing it. Just yesterday, we issued a methane proposal that on its own has the potential to move the needle by a percentage, maybe a percentage and a half in terms of movement towards our NDC. That's on top of what we will do with the Inflation Reduction Act. There's work to do to bend the cost curves and expand access to finance so that this stuff gets deployed, not just in America, but all around the world. And yeah, you know, on the point of, are we trying to make stuff in America? Yeah, it is an affirmative policy of the Biden administration to stamp products made in America and ship them all around the world, and that does not come at the exclusion of others. If there is a global race on clean energy, let us all be in it. And if we are, we will all come out winners. This is the decisive decade. We are taking decisive action, and I think in every conversation I'm having, we are now talking about how we can all go further and faster and go there together.
That was a really interesting discussion. And so thank you so much for joining me on it, everyone. And I appreciate all of you. Yeah.